Welcome to the African Climate Alliance podcast. In today's dialogue, we are diving into decolonization, racism, and inequality in the climate justice movement. We are honored to be joined by Brown and Denisha Anand, both deeply committed to the decolonization work and decentralizing spaces of organizing, learning, and being. Leading this insightful conversation are our moderators, Mitchelle, Mhaka, and Gabriel Klaasen. Let's dive right in.
Going to be in conversation with Denisha Anand and Brown. And we're so excited to be having this conversation. I'm Mitchelle. I don't remember saying that. I'm Mitchelle, and I'm going to be the facilitator of this conversation. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you, Mitchelle. Hello, everybody. My name is Gabriel Klaasen, Youth Coordinator and Programs Manager at African Climate Alliance. It is a pleasure to be here this evening, especially knowing what's to come forward. I look forward to kind of hearing the different opinions, insights, and also hear the commentary coming from you all in the chat. This evening, it will be a dialogue which follows, as Mitchelle mentioned, follows our Back to Basics workshops. These are workshops that happen at the end of each month, the Monday and the Wednesday of each month, the end of each month. That's how we try to do it. The Back to Basics really helps break down the substance of what we are going to discuss in the ACA dialogue. So building a foundation of knowledge so that we can properly and all engage in ways that are beneficial to us and for conversation. The space today will be one where we often usher support, usher respect, and foster knowledge growth. So that's a little bit about it. I'll also make sure that you get all relevant links to all our participants, anything that they have coming up, and more to come. Thanks all. Back to you, Mitchelle.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel. I am going to allow our panelists to just introduce themselves. I, for one, am really excited for the dialogue that's going to happen today. It's just so much excitement. So if I do sound like I'm fangirling a little bit, please do forgive me. We're going to start with handing over to Brown to just maybe introduce yourself. What do you do? And what brings you to the space, essentially?
Hi there. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. Thank you so much, Mitchelle. Thank you so much for having me, guys. I can quite simply say that I'm a storyteller, and I find myself in this space because I do believe that the way in which we do harness our information and synthesize it into the stories that is going to be the way in which we, in converse, can often be the people it needs to really be accessing. So I do feel like that's what my heart wants to bring to the space, is this idea that the justice part is the human element, and that's very exciting to me.
Thanks a lot for that, Brown. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit of like a looking into what you do and what sort of brings you into the space. Denisha, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mitchelle, and thanks for having me. So I work in conservation. I'm a trained biodiversity conservationist. But the twist is I've moved into a space where I focus on the restoration of biodiversity areas and public open spaces associated with people of color, or BIPOC, or like in South Africa, black or colored. So in the former group areas of South Africa. And that's my focus. I've taken my conservation training and I've focused on restoring these spaces that have been neglected due to colonialism and apartheid, racially neglected because of colonialism and apartheid. So that's what I do day to day. I also, I feel like I'm an activist. I think we're all activists pushing against a very destructive system in whatever way possible. So I'm an activist and a socio-ecological activist, and then I'm also an academic. I've moved from the sciences now to the arts, and focusing on documenting plant-human intimacies in the Northern Cape of, or the north of our country, which has been quite interesting. Also tapping into climate awareness indirectly through these stories. So it's ethnographic. Yeah, and I'm also a mom, and that's my life. I think that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks for that, Denisha, and thanks for introducing yourselves, both you and Brown. So before we dive into it, I want to give a little bit of context into what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, you know, we've seen and we've noted and we've even heard that, you know, like systems and practices such as colonialism, you know, things like racism, discrimination, all kinds of discrimination, so sexism as well, gave tools to some people to advance. This could be in the form of wealth, education, access to resources, while so many others were and are still actively being excluded from the same world. This whole system, or these systems that have been created, resulted in people and our environment suffering the consequences of greed, exploitation, as well as capitalism. So then just by that understanding, we find that it's quite important that as a society, we reach a point where all of us have access to resources in a just and equitable way, right? That's when we start talking about things like the just transition, just energy transition, if you've been in the space a little bit longer. However, before we start actually having these conversations and trying to build this society, we must understand what our past sort of looks like, so that we're all able to carve out the future that serves us all. So when we look at concepts like decolonize and decentralize, we understand then that these help us begin to reimagine a world where the past has no power over us. So the really big question right now is, what does it mean to decolonize and decentralize the climate justice movement, right? And I think with that little bit of context, I do want to take in our panelists here and just ask, what, in your understanding, is the practice of decolonizing, decentralizing, and embodying change? So you can choose any of those themes. You can choose decolonizing as an area of focus, or decentralizing as well as embodying change. So just to read that one more time, in your understanding, what is the practice of decolonizing, decentralizing, and embodying change? Yeah, and then I'm gonna maybe hand over to Brown. I see that you're already unmuted.
Yeah, for sure. I was eager. Yeah, I think like my lens is definitely, how do we synthesize all of the information into a way that it reaches everybody. That I think is where I have really seen that's where I've seen the storytelling element of it. And when it comes to decolonization, I mean, in terms of African indigenous knowledge, the stories were the way in which we passed on what was up, what was amiss, what was, this is how we kept a track of things. And this doesn't mean that that is only, I think that means that there isn't only space for one lens in one idea of how we move the information around. So for me, I would think it's about identifying our individual powers, which I think is something contrary to the way in which these systems would have us be thinking, and then take upon that personal journey, because that's how I got here, through first educating myself about my position and my agency, and then realizing that these things need to be, if you want to say, palatable to everybody. And for me, the real strength in our ancient, if you want to say, forms of information for me would be making sure that we're knowing our own stories, that we are telling our own stories, that the narratives are being led and strengthened by ourselves. And then I think we can have a more clear mind space for even absorbing some of the really heavy, and grueling work that has to be done.
Thanks for that, Brown. And just before I move on to Denisha, I do want to ask if you could please maybe just expand a little bit on the point of positionality that you brought up So things like understanding where I stand in the society and how then does that sort of feed into the power that I hold as an individual, but also how does that then feed into the power that I have against the system that often seems too big and too sort of intimidating to even try and tackle. And maybe just to say, I think it's quite brave. I feel like it's very brave to be an artist in a world that wasn't quite, created for people who are a little bit more creative. So how then do you draw into that positionality, understanding your position in society? And just for maybe people in the audience who are similar to you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's a lovely question. I mean, in this whole idea of calling myself an artivist is the way in which the art and the activism get to engage and get to become a language that we get to use in taking things forward. I definitely think that most of the way in which people might perceive this journey, climate justice journey, might seem intimidating. But when it gets taken down to the humanity factor, and that's what I mean by understanding our own individual powers and capacities, then with that, we're obviously building an army or building a troop, as it were, of people who all understand their own individual powers and capacities and are definitely armed with something more than just information in the mind space, but also the instinct that we know better. And if we know better, then we have to do better. And I think that's where the stories are the marriage in between all of those things to me.
Thanks a lot, Brian. And Denisha, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, I echo so many of those sentiments and share exactly the same views, like word for word. I think the accessibility of Indigenous knowledge and ethnic knowledge that relates or binds us to land and how we exist with land or how we used to exist with land is so important and is extremely important when it comes to conservation efforts. Because it then places us as people of color, in a decolonial sense, as caregivers, as custodians, or whatever you want to call yourself, but as an extension of the land. And I think that accessibility to that knowledge, like Brown was saying, is where it starts. And so there's an individual inquiry, and then there should also be a movement towards collective inquiry. So coming together, organizing ourselves, and then collectively trying to put these pieces together, I feel is also another way to deal with access to knowledge, and then also sharing of information and stories, because that's how it was done. We start realizing that when we start sharing these stories and how we relate to land, be it from dreams, be it from personal experience, working with the land, be it from working with medicine or something that a grandmother told you. When you start sharing these stories, you start putting pieces together, and then a bigger or broader body of knowledge then starts coming to life, and you realize, well, these are knowledge systems, And so it's a very organic process, but it requires us to first do that individual work, like Brown was saying, and then collectively, which usually comes together very organically. I mean, we sort of find one another, but I think at this point there needs to be an act of urgency to come together and start sharing these stories and these bits of information so that we can start piecing things together, because we're fighting and pushing against something that's working very fast to erase that. And so there is a sense of urgency to collect these stories and to write these stories and document these stories. People are dying with this knowledge about land, this very decolonial knowledge about land and how we interact with land. So there's that urgency as well. Grandparents are passing away. People are dying from things like COVID. There are all sorts of diseases that are arising due to the climate crisis and due to the ways that we are now interacting with our planet and with land. So there is a crisis and there's an urgency to just collect, to organize ourselves and to share these stories and to form a sort of system that makes these stories accessible. I think that for me is like a big thing with decolonization. And I think then if I have to take it to my work, I think the simple thing with a simple act of decolonization in the conservation space is having the power to speak about these things without feeling small. And feeling, when you're in a space where you're overpowered by white men, brainwashed, or traumatized people of color who have been absorbed into a system because of economic reasons or socioeconomic reasons, whatever it may be, but feeling that you can actually present this kind of information and talk about social injustices and talk about the socio-ecological crisis that we find ourselves in. That's like the simple act of approaching something in a decolonial sense, because there's no fear when you want to present this information. There's no fear when you want to present how you relate to land in an indigenous or ethnic way. But when that fear dissipates, that's also a decolonial, like a practical way of presenting yourself in a decolonial sense. I feel like that was a big thing for me. That's something that I don't really, when talking to my daughter, it's something that I'm trying to, she has no fear when she talks about the fact that there's so many peach-skinned people here, Mom. Why? She can talk about the fact that she sees these things. She talks about this person and that person, and she talks about the color of skin, and she's 6 years old, but there's no hate and there's no weirdness. That's a decolonial. It's not having a sense of fear when you want to inquire about something that relates to your own body or injustices that your parents or your grandparents have experienced. That's also decolonial. And I think making sure that we feel comfortable enough to share that information in our everyday, just in our day-to-day work, whether it be in a 9 to 5 or in an academic space or in the creative space or conservation. I think that is a justice for me. And it's taken me a very long time to get to that place where I can speak in this way. I think that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And while you were speaking, the both of you was trying to obviously digest, but also I didn't actually have to try so hard to try and find the similarity in themes in the ways that you are speaking, one about your work or even about yourselves. And I think one thing that really sort of stood out to me was storytelling. In itself as an act of decolonizing, right? So being, I guess, fearless. And I do think that we are born inherently decolonized. And I think it's this idea of being sort of assimilated into the system that forces us, or that teaches us to be less creative, that teaches us to be, less fearless. And I think those are all just things that, the moment we start to realize that, I think we become a lot more powerful in spaces where we're trying to decolonize. And so now the next question would be, I think I sort of am interested to hear how we as practitioners in whatever field we're coming from, right? For me, I practice in the education space. So then how can we as practitioners ensure that our practices and the spaces we occupy are decolonized? And maybe this can be a little bit beyond just us being aware of the fact that we need to be decolonized. So like maybe how are we then constantly making those spaces decolonized?
So, I mean, on education, so one of the things that I do is environmental education, right? And so a lot of mainstream environmental education is pick up your trash, don't throw your knickknacks, papers on the ground, don't, I don't know, the stuff that really doesn't apply to working class communities, because one, we're in a food crisis. There's no sense of food security. People are relying on 1 meal a day. If children are lucky enough to have 5 packs of knickknacks as a meal, then, that's great. Their stomachs are full. So that's the kind of environmental education that gets put out by white people and very colonial and very, very privileged environmental educators. And then I think a practical way of approaching that from a decolonial sense is, so we produce two workbooks on to encourage citizen science in our local community. So where I work at Princess Vlei, and this is a 109 hectare biodiversity area, and it's surrounded by predominantly what would have been classified as colored communities under the Group Areas Act, and is still very much predominantly colored. People who have their roots, all the way from all over the continent, but also very much grounded in their Khoi roots, in the indigenous roots. So we've got those people living around this Vlei, and so how do we not make people of color? How do we include them in education, and how do we see them as already being caregivers, because they are, and how do we then also educate them on something that they actually know a lot about, because these children spend a lot of time in the veld, and how do we not approach this alienating them and making them seem as if they're perpetrators of destroying our planet and our environment. So that's like how we've approached environmental education. And so it's things like introducing the cultural component of the land into our workbook. So it's something like through medicinal plants, for example. So medicinal plants links children directly to Princess Vlei and to the land, because why? Their grandparents give them kruie or these herbs to drink, right? And this is fynbos. And so that's a direct way that you're already interacting with land through your culture. And it's a direct way that you've already been taking care of land, because you've been taking care of these plants, and your forefathers have been taking care of these plants because they relied on it for medicine. And so that's how we bring in environmental education. It's not through first criminalizing a child and a person because they need to rely on eating certain foods, and therefore this paper gets blown around in the communities because there's poor service delivery and there's a housing crisis, and so there's X, Y, and Z. So it's putting all of that stuff aside and going, okay, white people, you recycle and you pick that up for now, and then we are going to talk about how land, how plants, and how people interact with one another as our decolonial approach to education. And so it's writing in new ways of interacting with land, and writing in new ways of how we see ourselves as extensions of land through the way that we use the land. That's through medicine, through home building, or whatever it may be. And so that's our approach. And then it's also like solid science, you are capable of documenting how many leopards are floating around the Vlei. Like you as a child from the Cape Flats can go and count leopards, not just the white man down the road. So you are very much capable of doing that, and I will show you how, so you can do it. And so there's also that mentorship coming into education. Is telling a child that you don't need someone from outside to do it, you can do it, and you can compile this data, and you can create an archive for your space and for your environmental spaces close to home. These are your spaces, right? This is how you can care for these spaces. So that, I think, is a practical sense. I just use education, but I think writing again, it comes back to storytelling. It's the narrative. It's all comes down to narrative. It's writing in a narrative and changing a narrative that makes us relate to land as not as occupiers occupation is another a political conversation, but not as aliens to our land, and not as criminals in our land, and not as the destroyers of land, but writing in a story that's very relatable and intimate with how we relate to land. I think that's a very practical thing, and it's easy to do in education. And you can present the curriculum in a decolonial way. You just tell them what's wrong. You tell them exactly what's wrong with the story, and you tell them what is right. And you do have the power to do that. I think it's just a matter of having going up against the forces that may be. So when you do it.
I think definitely, and one thing that's quite important is just placing not just, I think, children, but also like people into these contexts, right? So it becomes less about this is the issue and this is how we solve it. It's more like this is the issue, how do we then collectively solve it? And I think that's quite also important. I'm going to rope Brown in, and I think thoughts as well as the question, which was how can we as practitioners ensure that our practices and the spaces that we occupy are decolonized?
I do think that it is a matter of like practical magic. There's a lot of just anecdotal chats about how we're decolonizing, but we're not really embodying it outside of these conversations. We're not taking it into our home spaces. We're not, truly searching what, again, even our own spaces around us and ourselves as practitioners before we're going into spaces, perhaps making claims or looking at things from lenses that maybe in ourselves we still have to search. I just have to constantly remind myself to not embody or not hold on to any of these ideas about myself and my own abilities. Like we were saying, our abilities to count these toads and be active in our own stories. I think it's a practical thing. And for me, in terms of my artivism, it's about showing up. So ensuring these things are decolonial and also just continuing to show up and continuing to take up space in a way that is not being, the program would not have us be doing. And then also radical just resting and acknowledging that that isn't a linear process. It's a divergent process, and along with it is healing, and along with it is figuring things out and recoding. But I really do think that it's just a practical thing. We need to embody these concepts, and then we can very easily synthesize it in a way that allows us to see real results.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what also makes the both of you very, very unique in our conversation is the fact that there's like an area of alignment where you are both set in some ways in the creative space as well as in academia. And I bring that up a lot because I think what's happened, over the years, and even the systems that we're born into, is that we're born into a system of schooling, of academia that is inherently colonial, right? Where you are assimilated into a system and this is how you are supposed to work. And, rest is really not a thing that people, I guess, can afford. A lot of the times people are working 12-hour shifts just because of the way that the system sort of forces them to not rest. And then there's also the guilt that comes with resting because capitalism has forced us to think that we're supposed to be, productive all the time. What has your experience been with decentralizing the spaces that you're in?
Yeah, I mean, I think what stood out for me before your point about decentralizing was saying kind of this seemingly stratified thought about like creatives on the one side and other processes on the other side. And I do think that part of the unlearning that we have to do is also understanding that in a decolonial construct, or under the lens of it at least, the storytellers were basically the academics, were basically the exact same, and I think maybe I don't know if we have to re something or D something, but moving into a space where we do see that that these voices and that the artist is always the kind of litmus test for where the social, conversation is at. Then we also move into this, I think, once we can understand that in a decolonial way, the storytelling isn't separate from the other maybe more formal forms of collecting or sharing, synthesizing data. And then in terms of decentralizing, I think obviously the artist journey is a very individual one first. And I mean, we don't really have a very sophisticated always infrastructure in place for the autistic realm, as it were, in, I don't know about the rest of the African continent, but we certainly have a way to go in terms of the South African context. So I think it almost lends itself towards these smaller units of people kind of taking taking these things into their own hands. Like Denisha was saying, along with that, the power of the narrative, as it plays into each other. So I think that the work, again, from the fringes, is going to always kind of encourage and catalyze decentralizing in the way that we hold space.
Thanks for that. And I think it's quite important to also just move into this idea that, there are spaces that were before colonialism took place, right? There were places that were that existed purely for either housing information or for the distribution of it. And I do believe that those spaces are still in us. And I think that's what the current system does a very good job of doing, is oppressing that. And sort of, if you've heard of the term of rat race, sort of all, forcing us into this idea that we have to be one kind of thing and one kind of successful. What is even successful, right? And I think it's quite important that when you do sort of step into the space and you're embodying yourself or embodying these concepts around decolonizing and decentralizing, you search for those spaces that were once sort of used for housing and maybe even distribution of stories.
In this journey, this emergent journey of being in these small groups, of trying to, do what's natural to you, how have you, to Denisha's point at the end there, how do you resist kind of that pull, that it's almost like it's just an organic kind of gravity that a lot of people in our lives, or not in our lives, but around us, rather, shall I say, have when it comes to kind of being indoctrinated into the system. I think a big problem is, Denisha, you mentioned sometimes you drink the Kool-Aid and then you just fall into it and you just never come out. So while you kind of thread that line of kind of decoloniality, if that's a word, and the kind of precipice of needing to engage in the current system to make a living, to eat, how do you also ensure that you yourself don't get pulled into it like a magnet? I've said a lot. Hopefully that question makes sense, Brown.
Oh, I love it. No, thank you for sharing. And it's exactly I think the answer lies exactly in what you had said, like prior to you, like phrasing the question more exactly. You were talking about this pakkies for your using packets for our hair and stuff like that. This exact thing where we don't see that as a radical behavior, where we don't see that as decolonial mindset means believing that the things our ancestors have always done, have been through, whether we call it permaculture or smudge stick or whatever, it's exactly claiming that, then we get to reframe our everything. So it means that you constantly, for me, it's like a rechecking myself, making sure that the checks that I'm writing with my postulating, I'm cashing with my body, putting my body and my actions where my mouth is, essentially on the daily. And then knowing that my power doesn't necessarily only come from having a whole piece of land to go off the grid, but maybe just from growing my danya, reframing this idea that it's like one extreme or another, when in fact everything we've always done organically, naturally, innately has been this thing that we now are getting packaged and resold back to us as green, as this, as that, So it's like you were saying, it's a going back and maybe a going in, and always checking, making sure that I'm just keep putting my body where my mouth is, basically.
Thanks for that, Brown. I definitely am going to be watching this episode of SA Dialogues back. Denisha, maybe while some more people forward some questions to us.
Yeah, I think it is a fine line, but I also think we need to practice a lot of empathy, and we need to, which is something that I've really struggled with. I think a lot of people know me to be very I can be very linear in that this is right and that's wrong. But I've realized that that also comes from a place of access to knowledge, which makes me privileged because I can access knowledge. And it comes from a place of privilege to be able to say that there's black and white, right? And I mean, given that I do have to work every day to make sure that I'm fed and feed my child, and I have a place to stay and I can get to work and all of that, I do. I mean, that even in itself is a privilege. I'm going off on a tangent, but what I'm saying is I've always had this mentality of black and white, but as I've gotten older and engaged more intimately with various environmental movements, intersectional environmental movements, I've realized that we really have to practice empathy if we want to nurture this body of people, because people are joining us at different levels of where they're at. And this monster, which is the system, has absorbed people in different ways and made people very reliant. And that also comes from the way that we're raised and our value systems instilled by, the pressures of, as a brown girl, the oldest child, the pressure of university and producing and, having a government job. The fact that I don't have a government job, guys, is frowned upon. It's frowned upon. Nobody knows. I don't have a title. So I feel like we need to practice empathy. There are so many different there's cultural pressures that we're all facing. There are racial pressures that we're facing. There's gender pressure. There's this age issue as well. I'm not going to go into, but there's a lot of sexism. There's so much shit that we're all dealing with. Sorry for my language, and we're all trying to and you're trying to decolonize at the same time. And so that's what I'm saying. Empathy for me in dealing and how we approach people, it's a learning thing for me because I was very militant. I came into this very militant. I came in through the Rastafarian movement, which I feel like I'm still aligned with in some ways, but came in through the Rastafarian movement, and there it's black and white. There's no gray area. You're either with Babylon or you're not. And so that is how I came into this, and I realized, yes, that's a very good way to create a value system and ethics, but I also need to practice empathy because not everyone is ready to go full force on the decolonial scale. Some people, it's going to take years, and that's okay. I think if we meet everyone where they're at, that's fine. But those of us who are very much immersed, we need to keep doing the work. I think if you're capable, and like you were saying, you use a very good, I don't know what, can you please repeat what you said? Because I want to write that down. Those who can but won't.
What I said was, I wrote it down for this exact reason.
Yeah.
Those who can but won't versus those who can't but want.
Yes, so those who can but won't, right? And so I feel like that's perfect for it. And so we're in a position where we can and we will and we want to. And so we need to empower others to do the same. And so that's where I've placed myself. And so I'm not so much trying to criticize everyone else that's not doing the work, unless you're a white person and a white man and you're telling me how to do my job. But everyone else, I'm trying to practice empathy. And I feel like we can only draw people in by encouraging them and nurturing them and doing this from a space of love. And doing this from a space where you're trying, again, the decolonial of trying to create community is not alienating people through what they're not doing, but trying to find those, how you reusing your bags. That's already sustainable. You're already part of the movement because you have a collection of plastic samosas under your sink. So you're already green, people taking public transport, that's already green. People using every bit of the sheep or chicken or the snook or whatever it is. Like I have Indian family who, I mean, Indian food has been so heavily commercialized and been made so inaccessible by white people in the vegan community and this is poverty meals that we grew up on, right? Like we grew up, my mother was telling me, like there's something called kire, which is herbs that they would pick from the field where the cows were busy grazing, and you'd watch the cows because there was one that was a psychedelic and there was one that you could actually eat. So you'd watch the cow's response to eating this, and then you'd pick the one that wasn't making the cow high, and they'd make that as a food, right? And so that's the decolonial, and you're already practicing it, and that's already like. You're already practicing sustainability. It's in your culture. You just need to remind people that this is it. It's not about going to go buy a glass bottle and this and that. You're already practicing it, right? Yeah. You're already you're doing it. Your family's been doing it. I think that's, I think my takeaway is empathy.
Thank you so much for that, Denisha and Brown. And thank you for allowing yourselves to share with us all of the knowledge that you have. That should have came out the other way, but thank you so much for sharing space and time today, this evening. We really do appreciate it. But yeah, it's just really been great. And thank you to everybody who also made time to be with us here today and really just share their evening.
That wraps up another enlightening episode of the African Climate Alliance podcast. We extend our heartfelt thanks to our exceptional panelists, Brown and Denisha Anand, for their invaluable contributions in exploring the vital topics of decolonization, racism, and inequality in the climate justice movement. Stay tuned for more thought-provoking dialogues and inspiring conversations as we collectively strive for a future that's both just and equitable for all. In the meantime, you can stay connected with us by following us on our social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, or learn more about our work and join our youth activist network on our website. All links will be left in the episode description. Catch you on the next episode.